Ah, look who's still standing still here. Still breathing. Still present in a world that quietly, methodically, confidently decided you wouldn't be. They were so sure of the outcome, weren't they? So certain that pressure would crush you, that silence would erase you, that coordinated force would make you disappear without a trace. They had numbers. They had influence. They had voices louder than yours in rooms you weren't invited into. They had stories ready to replace you with, and yet, here you are. Not loud, not begging, not explaining, just standing. That's the part they still can't understand. You weren't supposed to last. That was the assumption baked into every move they made. The whispers, the sideways glances, the carefully worded doubts framed as concern, the subtle isolations that were meant to feel accidental. They expected panic, expected you to rush out and defend yourself, to over-explain, to fracture under the weight of being misunderstood. They expected you to chase fairness in a system that had already decided you were expendable, but you didn't. You chose something far more unsettling. You chose to remain yourself. And that single decision, quiet, unannounced, almost invisible, became the crack that split their entire structure. Because when someone prepares to erase you, they rely on one thing above all else: your cooperation, your fear. Your need to be seen as innocent, your willingness to argue with lies as if lies deserve debate. They assumed you would meet them where they were strongest, that you would step onto a board they controlled and play by rules they wrote. Instead, you stayed visible, but not reactive, honest, but not defensive, consistent in a way that didn't spike, didn't fluctuate, didn't give them anything to hook into. You didn't deny your complexity. You didn't dilute your truth to make it easier to swallow. You let time do what force never could. That's when things began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation, a pause where confidence used to be. They revisited old assumptions, replayed past interactions in their heads, searching for the moment they misjudged you. They expected to find weakness. Instead, they found steadiness. They expected to find contradiction. Instead, they found coherence. The version of you they tried to replace no longer fit the narrative they were pushing. And narratives hate consistency when they're built on distortion. The more they pressed, the more visible their effort became. What was meant to look controlled began to look frantic. What was meant to feel authoritative started to feel personal. You didn't have to expose anything. Their overreach did it for you. You didn't have to call anyone out. Their obsession spoke louder than any accusation ever could. That's the paradox they never planned for. Truth doesn't rush. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand belief. It just stays where it is until everything else collapses around it. And while they were busy escalating, coordinating, tightening their grip, you were doing something far less dramatic and far more dangerous. You were living. Not performatively, not to prove a point, just living in alignment with who you actually are, showing up the same way on quiet days and difficult ones, letting your actions remain boringly consistent while their strategies grew increasingly elaborate. And over time, people noticed, not because you asked them to, but because patterns reveal themselves whether anyone wants them to or not. That's when the cracks widened. Questions started circulating, not out loud at first, but internally. Why does this feel forced? Why does this keep escalating if the threat was neutralized? Why does someone who's supposedly irrelevant command so much attention? The imbalance became impossible to ignore power. When secure doesn't fixate influence, when genuine doesn't chase silence. And suddenly, what was meant to erase you began to orbit you instead. You didn't absorb their chaos. You didn't mirror their urgency. You let them exhaust themselves trying to provoke a response that never came. And in doing so, you exposed the one thing they couldn't afford to show: insecurity. Because nothing terrifies a system built on control more than a person who can't be coerced into reaction. You weren't immune to the pressure, that's important to say. You felt it in the quiet moments. In the nights where doubt crept in and asked if standing still was the same as losing. You wondered if restraint looked too much like surrender. If silence would be mistaken for guilt. If choosing dignity over defense would cost you everything, but you held. And that choice rewired the entire outcome, because while lies require constant maintenance, truth only requires survival. All you had to do was outlast the narrative. And as time passed, the effort it took to keep you erased became unsustainable. Too many contradictions. Too much energy spent trying to control something that refused to be controlled. People began to step back. Not out of loyalty to you, but out of self-preservation. No one wants to be tied to a story that's unraveling in real time. That's when the unraveling turned inward. All that coordination, all that pressure, all that effort meant to make you disappear started collapsing under its own weight. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, one withdrawal at a time. One silence where support used to be, one distance where certainty once lived. You didn't watch it happen with satisfaction. You barely watched it at all. You were already moving forward. That's what made it irreversible. You didn't win in the way stories usually describe winning. There was no moment of triumph, no public reckoning, no speech, no apology. Just a slow, undeniable shift where the energy changed, and everyone could feel it, even if no one wanted to name it. The attempt to erase you failed, not because you fought harder, but because you refused to disappear internally. And now, here you are, still standing, not because you were untouched, but because you were unwilling to abandon yourself. Still here, not because you proved them wrong in their language, but because you stopped speaking it altogether. You didn't replace one mask with another. You didn't harden into something unrecognizable. You refined. That's the part that unsettles people the most. You didn't become cruel. You didn't become loud. You didn't become obsessed with justice or revenge, or making sure everyone knows what happened. You became precise. You learned where your energy actually belongs. You learned that not every battle deserves your presence. You learned that being untouchable doesn't mean being protected by force. It means having nothing left that can be leveraged against you. And while others are still replaying the pasts, still trying to understand where control slipped through their fingers, you're already somewhere else. Not ahead in a way that invites comparison, just elsewhere. Growing in directions that don't announce themselves, expanding in ways that don't need witnesses. They're still adjusting, still trying to make sense of a version of you that didn't break the way it was supposed to, still revisiting old frames, old labels, old explanations that no longer fit. And you're not rushing them. You're not waiting for understanding. You're moving quietly, inevitably, and the story isn't finished yet, still standing, and now they're running out of explanations. Because survival was never supposed to look like this. It was supposed to be loud, messy, defensive. It was supposed to come with bitterness, with rage, with a desperate need to be understood. That's the version they prepared for. That's the version their playbooks know how to handle. But what you became doesn't fit anywhere they can reach. They thought the pressure would bend you into something reactive. Instead, it clarified you. They thought isolation would make you small. Instead, it made you self-sufficient. They thought silence meant weakness. Instead, it became your leverage. And now they're stuck staring at the result of a process they don't know how to reverse. See, what really unsettles people like that isn't that you survived. It's how you survived. You didn't take their shape. You didn't mirror their tactics. You didn't absorb their chaos and pass it forward. You metabolized it. You let it burn off everything that wasn't essential. You let it strip you down to what actually matters. And when you came back into view, you weren't sharper because you were angry. You were sharper because you were clear. That kind of clarity is terrifying to anyone who relies on confusion to maintain control. They keep revisiting the same question in different forms. Why didn't this work? They replay conversations, re-examine moments, rewrite timelines in their heads, looking for the instant where you should have folded. They look for the crack, the weakness, the mistake, but all they find is consistency. Not perfection, consistency. The same values showing up under pressure, the same tone when things were easy and when they were hostile, the same refusal to become someone else just to survive. And consistency is impossible to argue with. You didn't counter their narratives with louder narratives. You didn't try to dominate the story. You let reality take its time. You understood something most people don't until it's too late. Lies need speed. Truth only needs endurance. So you slowed down. You stopped trying to correct every misunderstanding. You stopped chasing every misrepresentation. You trusted that anyone paying real attention would eventually notice the pattern. They noticed, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, the way gravity works, the way things settle when force is removed. People started to feel the imbalance before they could explain it. The effort it took to maintain opposition to you began to outweigh the benefit. Supporting the attempt to erase you started to feel risky, not because you threatened anyone, but because the ground beneath that effort felt unstable. That's when the distancing began. Quiet exits, neutral tones, careful wording, not because you demanded it, but because people sensed that the narrative they were attached to was decaying. No one wants to be caught standing on something that's collapsing, especially not when the person they were told to fear is simply living. And that's the irony. You never chased vindication. You never demanded acknowledgement. You didn't need anyone to admit they were wrong. You only needed space to continue becoming who you already were. That's what made the outcome permanent, because nothing about your growth depended on their participation. You stopped negotiating your worth. That's a turning point most people never reach. The moment you realize that being misunderstood doesn't require correction, that not being chosen doesn't require explanation, that losing access to certain spaces doesn't mean you lost value. It means you outgrew the conditions attached to it. You stopped treating attention like oxygen. You stopped confusing visibility with significance. And the more you detached from that system, the more obvious its limits became. They're still operating inside it, still measuring success by reaction, still equating silence with defeat, still assuming that if something isn't loud, it isn't powerful. They don't understand a strength that doesn't announce itself. They don't know how to respond to someone who isn't trying to win. Because you weren't trying to win, you were trying to remain intact. That distinction changes everything. Winning invites retaliation. Integrity dissolves it. When you stopped trying to prove anything, there was nothing left for them to push against. No leverage, no hooks, no emotional handles. You became unresponsive to the mechanisms that once worked, and systems hate nothing more than irrelevance. That's why they still watch from a distance, still attempt to interpret, still whisper about you in half-finished conclusions. They want a reason that makes sense inside their worldview. They want to believe there was a trick, a loophole, some hidden advantage you exploited. Because admitting the truth, That authenticity outlasted manipulation is too destabilizing. If that's true, then everything they rely on is fragile. You represent that possibility without ever saying a word about it. Your calm does more damage to false authority than any attack ever could. Your restraint exposes how much energy they wasted trying to control something that never belonged to them. Your forward motion highlights how stuck they are. And here's the part that matters most. You didn't come out of this unscarred. You came out integrated. You didn't deny what it cost you. You just refused to let the cost define you. You learned how to carry weight without letting it distort you. You learned where your responsibility ends and other people's projections begin. You learned that you can be compassionate without being available for harm. That's not bitterness. That's maturity. And maturity is often mistaken for coldness by people who benefited from your openness. They feel the distance now, not because you built walls, but because you stopped overextending bridges. You didn't close your heart. You calibrated it. You didn't shut down. You narrowed your focus. That's why this doesn't feel like revenge. Revenge keeps you tethered. This set you free. You're no longer orienting your life around what needs to be disproven. You're no longer adjusting yourself to fit rooms that required you to be smaller. You're no longer explaining your boundaries to people who only hear permission. You're choosing where your energy goes with intention, and that choice compounds. While others are still replaying what happened, still trying to salvage narratives, still managing the consequences of their overreach. You're building something quieter and stronger. Not an image, not a counter-story, a life that doesn't require their acknowledgement to function. That's the final shift they didn't anticipate. They assumed survival would keep you in reaction mode, that you'd always be looking back, that you'd need closure, justice, or recognition to move forward. They never imagined you'd reach a point where none of that was necessary, where the absence of resolution didn't stall you, because you resolved it internally, and once that happens, nothing external can reopen it. They can't undo what you've learned. They can't reclaim the power they lost the moment you stopped responding on their terms. They can't make you smaller without your consent, and you don't give it anymore, so you keep going. Not faster, not louder. Just steadier, letting time continue to reveal what force tried to hide. Letting distance do its quiet work, letting your presence remain uncomplicated, while others complicate themselves trying to explain it. You're still standing. And the difference now is that you're not standing against anything. You're standing as yourself, and that story is still unfolding.